All right, this lecture is about energy, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. It's based on content from Chapter 3, Environmental Systems. The lecture will introduce the following: potential energy, kinetic energy, and chemical energy, the electromagnetic spectrum, autotrophs and photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. Let's start out with a discussion of energy fundamentals. Energy can change the position, physical composition, or temperature of matter. Okay? There are two fundamental types of energy: potential energy and kinetic energy. Potential energy is the energy of position, whereas kinetic energy is the energy of motion. So, for instance, water that is stored behind a dam is an example of potential energy. If you let that water go, right, and rush out, that's an example of kinetic energy. Chemical energy is a special type of potential energy that is held in the bonds between atoms. Okay, so remember, molecules and compounds are atoms that are connected by bonds. When you break those bonds, energy is released. So, when that happens, potential energy is changed into kinetic energy, and that is utilized to produce motion, action, and heat, as in this example below. So here you have glucose, right, which is in the food, and glucose is uh, a chemical energy, right? So it's a potential energy, and in your body, as you're digesting it, in the presence of oxygen, right? Uh, this is called cellular respiration. You'll break that down into some byproducts: carbon dioxide, right? Water, and heat and kinetic energy, right? There's energy that's released from the bonds, that potential energy of the glucose molecule. And this process, again, is called cellular respiration. We'll look at it in a few minutes. The sun's energy powers life, and as you can see, the radiation that comes from the sun uh, it can be divided into a spectrum based on its wavelengths, everything from gamma rays to X-rays to ultraviolet to visible to infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. And essentially, it's another scale, right? As you go this direction, right, you end up with higher energy, shorter wavelengths. And as you go this direction, right, the wavelengths are getting longer, right? You can see that they're in meters here, and they're getting much longer as you go this direction, and lower energy. In the center here is the visible light spectrum. You may have heard of Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right, as you go across the visible light spectrum. This is the light that we can see. Two other light forms that come into discussion kind of normally, we hear about ultraviolet light or UV light, right, because this is the sunlight. This is a part of sunlight that causes tanning and burning and skin cancer, causing mutations, right? And so we're trying to protect against UV light. The second type is infrared light. This is heat, essentially. So if you're looking at those, using those glasses that you can see at night, right? You can see the energy of an organism, a living organism. That's because you can see the infrared that's being given off by that organism. Autotrophs and photosynthesis. Okay, so light energy powers most living systems, right? The sun supplies energy to those organisms that are able to use it to produce their own food. So if you can produce your own food, you are known as an autotroph, a self-feeder, auto self-troph feeding, or a primary producer, right? So these are things like plants and algae and some bacteria that can manufacture their own food using sunlight. The process of photosynthesis that is used by primary producers. These primary producers can turn light energy from sun into chemical energy, right? Which in the form of glucose, right? Those bonds between the glucose molecules. So photosynthesis is a series of chemical reactions that turns light energy from the sun into chemical energy. They can be broken down and used by organisms as an energy source. The basic idea, right, is that producers or autotrophs take in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. So essentially, if you think about it as a plant, right, this plant is taking in water from the roots, it's taking in carbon dioxide through little pores in the leaves, little openings, and it's catching that radiation of sunlight that we saw in the electromagnetic spectrum. Inside the leaf, then, the process is creating, right, this molecule, this macromolecule or carbohydrate called glucose. And that glucose is storing the energy from that sunlight, right? And there's another byproduct, and that is oxygen. O2 is given off by plants. Okay, so you have the basic idea here of what's going on with photosynthesis. Sunlight plus carbon dioxide plus water to create or synthesize glucose and give off a byproduct of oxygen. When we think about photosynthesis and the production of food, we can again start with our leaf here, and we can think about the process. Inside that leaf are organelles, right, called chloroplasts. These are inside the chloroplast, okay, let me slow down here. Inside the leaf are the cells, right? The leaf is made up of many cells. Each of the cells has inside of them these organelles called chloroplasts. And inside the chloroplast is a molecule, right? A large compound called chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is the compound that it can absorb the sunlight and do the reactions that are needed to create food from raw materials and sunlight. There are two steps, right? In this case, you've got the light dependent reactions, right, where light is needed, and in this case solar energy is used, right? Solar energy is absorbed by the light absorbing pigment chlorophyll, and that energy from the solar energy is used to split water. So here is water, and here is O2 that's been split from that water. Okay, here's an oxygen molecule that's given off, the hydrogen continues on. So solar energy is used to split water and form oxygen in a small high energy molecule, right, that fuels the light independent reactions. We used to call that the Kelvin cycle. We used to call that the dark cycle. It's often called the Kelvin cycle. Okay, this is the reaction that is not dependent on light. Doesn't mean it's in the dark, but it uses chemical energy to run it. And this is where you have carbon atoms from carbon dioxide are linked into sugars, in this case glucose. So two stages, light dependent, light independent, in the process of photosynthesis. Here is the equation for photosynthesis. It's streamlined and balanced. You've got 6 molecules or compounds of carbon dioxide plus 6 water compounds plus energy from the sun, hence the photo, right? And this arrow says that the chemical reaction is going in this direction, and that creates or synthesizes C6H12O6. This is the sugar glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules. Now, if you look at this chemical reaction, you'll see that it balances, that there are the same number of carbons on each side of it, the same number of hydrogens, and the same number of oxygens. So even though matter has been changed, it has not been created or destroyed, right? This is the reaction in which all life, right, is dependent, or nearly all life. Cellular respiration is uh, the way that we burn or utilize that energy that is created during photosynthesis, that potential energy. Cellular respiration releases chemical energy. Uh, all organisms have some sort of respiration so that they can feed themselves. And in cellular respiration is used by plants, animals, fungi, bacteria. They're all using it to get their energy from whatever they're eating. Organisms use stored energy, including the energy created by photosynthesis via respiration, which splits sugar molecules and releases chemical energy. Just like that initial segment we talked about, you take that glucose, that potential energy in the glucose, you break it apart, right? And you get energy that can be used by the cells in the organisms to do the work they need to do, to maintain, to build, etc. This process, right, occurs, as I said, in autotrophs, primary producers like plants, and in heterotrophs, organisms that are dependent on eating other organisms, right? So animals, fungi, and most microbes. Here is the chemical equation for cellular respiration. You'll note it's the exact opposite of the equation for photosynthesis. So in this case, we start with the macromolecule glucose, C6H12O6, the sugar. In the presence, in this case, if this is aerobic cellular respiration, in the presence of oxygen, right, this is burnt, right? Essentially, it's like a fire. It burns and breaks those bonds and releases the energy. You get carbon dioxide given off, you get water given off, and you get chemical energy in the form of ATP in order to do the cells or organisms work, right? We need to break down sugar to get this energy source. We need to get that energy between the atoms so that so that our cells and other organisms can do the work they need to do. Now there are some ecosystems uh, where the sunlight isn't the main power source. Uh, the hydrothermal vent ecosystems were discovered in 1977 when an oceanographic expedition aboard the submersible research craft Elvin studied the Galapagos Rift. So they were down deep in the ocean in a rift area. They're down over 8,000 feet, and at this at that depth, right, there's no light at all. It's just completely dark. Um, but there are these hot springs you can see in this black smoker here, and these are giving off sulfur-rich, very hot water. And essentially, there are bacteria that are able to use that chemical energy, that heat and sulfur, to make their own food. We call this process not photosynthesis, but chemo, meaning chemical synthesis. Those bacteria are living inside of these giant tube worms here, right? Are really interesting organisms, 6 feet or so in length, and they're symbiosis, meaning they live together with those bacteria. Okay, so they get their energy again from the primary producers, which in this case are chemosynthesizers down in the deep ocean. There are other organisms as well, shrimp, crabs, etc. We'll probably look at this ecosystem one more time. I just wanted to kind of bring it up for now. All right, that concludes our lecture on energy, photosynthesis, and cellular respiration.